Welcome back, puppies, to Barking Dog's miniature painting video. Please like, share, and subscribe. You can follow us on Facebook, and you can support us on Patreon. Welcome back, this is Christian. Today we're going to be going over how I prep and prime my miniatures and some of the tools that are involved. Right there we have some clippers, some tweezers, a pin vise, which won't actually be getting used in this video. And there's the two miniatures, there's an X-Acto knife, and then of course their bases. These miniatures are from an early 2000s Wizards of the Coast line that are no longer in production. They're actually two of the iconic characters from the 3rd edition Player's Handbook, Ember the Monk and Krusk the Barbarian. There we have some jeweler's files. Again, the clippers. Tweezers, they don't get used this video either. But the X-Acto knife, of course, will get used if we're dealing with some mold lines and flash. Okay, so here what you see me doing is clipping off part of the tab that goes in the slot, and I do this because I'll be putting them into epoxy later. But again, more on that later. So what you see me doing, covering that with my hand, is because if you don't do that and you just clip it off, a lot of times that little piece will go flying, and you may or may not find it later. It could poke your eye out, I guess. But as a general rule of thumb, just kind of hold on to it or cup it in my hand like you saw me doing, so when it does fly off, it doesn't leave your hand. And there, what you saw me doing, clipping out the middle part of the tab, sometimes when you're doing that, because of the nature of how thick the metal is and how soft it is, it'll actually push the feet apart a little bit. That actually happens when I go to clip that center part of the tab out of between the monk's feet, and I forgot to push her feet back in a little bit. So you'll see where I struggle later on as a result of that. But if you're mindful of it, and typically I am, you can just kind of push their feet back. It's not much of an issue. So if you notice, I am leaving some of the tab underneath the foot, and again, that's important because we'll be stabbing that down into the epoxy later. So right there, what I'm trying to show is some of the flash on her face. It comes right down kind of on the middle of her face. There's a mold line there, and then underneath her chin is what I call flash. It's just where there's excess metal. And here I've sped the footage up a little bit, but that's me filing the mold line down. Of course, that mold line travels through the center of her face, over her shoulder there. Right there, I'm just using a razor to try to get some of it out. That's the X-Acto knife I have in my hand. Just trying to trim or scrape some of that mold or the flash, the excess flash away. Sometimes you can use the X-Acto knife too, also just to kind of level out the mold line. Sometimes if you do it just right, you don't have to go back over it with a file, but the file is always a nice touch because it helps it kind of blend in with this surrounding part of the figure. And there she had some of the mold line in her hair on top of her head. And you want to search over the miniature real good and look for those mold lines, and even look for them in little nooks and crannies, like under her arm there, the one that's kind of coming back behind her and grabbing the staff farther towards the middle there. Because a lot of times you might not notice it if you're not looking for it until you hit it with primer. Once you get this primed, if you didn't get rid of all your mold lines or seam lines or any flash, the primer will be a really good tattletale. In which case, if that happens, it's not the end of the world. You go ahead and trim it away or file it back down, and then just hit it with some more primer. And there you see me filing down some more on her arm. And there I'm just cleaning up the end of the staff a little bit. And wherever you have a seam line on top, like on top of the arm, you're going to find it underneath also. Same with the legs. If you got a seam line, or a mold line I should say, running down one part of the leg, odds are you're going to have one on the other part of the leg. So Just keep in mind wherever that mold line is, that's where the miniature's kind of split in half. So that was Ember, and this is Krusk. Just cleaning up his axe a little bit there. He didn't really have too many mold lines on him. Didn't really require as much work as she did. One of the nice things about the jeweler files that I have is there's like 3 different ones. One's kind of round, one's kind of going to be shaped triangular where there's like 3 sides on it, and then this one is actually completely flat on one side and then convex on the other side, so it's kind of like half round. And that helps you kind of navigate the different curvatures of the miniature. Again, you always want to double check the inside of legs, or both sides of the arm. The top of your weapons, like there you see me going after the top of the axe. Those are common places actually on figures that are holding an axe. For some reason that mold line will run right down the center of that blade. I imagine some of that's done on purpose just to help kind of minimize the mold line. But what you end up with is always having that mold line run down the top of the axe. Right there, what you saw was 91% isopropanol alcohol. Excuse me. It's what I use to clean the miniatures. You'll be seeing me bust some of that out later. Again, I use 91% and a toothbrush, which you'll see me getting here in a minute. It's always a good idea to wear rubber gloves when you're doing this, or latex gloves of some sort if you don't have a latex allergy. I didn't put them on for this one. The alcohol is not going to hurt you, but it will just dry out your skin. Of course, I don't know, some of you might have an allergy to isopropanol. Mostly it's just really bad about drying out your skin though, so I'd recommend wearing gloves, although I don't wear them here. So as you see, I just get toothbrush and that puddle from where I just poured the alcohol on the miniatures and on the bases. I just dip the brush in that puddle, scrub the heck out of the brush, trying to get all the nooks and crannies to get rid of any mold release or any oils that might have transferred from my hand onto the figure, anything that would actually cause the primer not to adhere. Here you see me getting out some of the epoxy, and that's a roller I'm going to be using to give the epoxy on the base some texture. Now this is a 2-part epoxy. This is green stuff epoxy. There are other brands out there. Milliput. I actually used Milliput for years before I started using actual green stuff. Milliput works just fine. So there you see me just kneading the 2 halves of the epoxy putty together. The blue and bright green until you get kind of a dark green color. That's what we want. And that's just kind of how I mix it. I knead it between my fingers to get it kind of warm and soft, and then I start twisting it around, and I'll roll it up and then fold it over and twist it some more and knead it some more. Just keep going back and forth till you get a nice consistent dark green color. There you can see we're starting to get that green color that we're looking for. Here I'm just kind of pressing it down, and I'm actually looking for any little spots, because occasionally you'll find a couple of spots that didn't get mixed up real well, and you have like a little yellow spot or a little blue spot here, there. But that's actually starting to look pretty good. So I just tore off a little piece, set the bigger part of it aside, and I'm going to roll this to something that looks like it'll fit kind of in that slot on the base. Now the white thing you see me working on there, that's actually a ceramic tile like you'd put on a wall in a bathroom or a kitchen. I just like using the surface of that because not a lot sticks to it. So there you see me pressed that epoxy down into the slot on the base, and I just got some water I have from a paint mug. In this case that was clean water, but I have used dirty paint water before. It doesn't really affect anything. I just grab whatever's nearest to me water wise and start spreading that epoxy out over the surface of the base. And the water's nice because it helps keep the putty from sticking to your finger as you're trying to spread it around and you're actually applying a lot of pressure to it. But the epoxy will still adhere to the base really well. And that, what you end up with is getting a lot of fingerprints in the epoxy also. And so here you see me kind of running my finger around in circles or back and forth. That's me trying to work out any of the fingerprints, or at least trying to minimize them as much as possible, as well as make sure that we got a good kind of even spread. In this case, the bases that I'm using actually have a lip on them, so I'm trying to keep the epoxy from going too far over that lip. Double check the back side to make sure it's not pushed out too far there, because some will get pushed out later, and we'll trim that off. And here I'm just using a roller from green stuff, and I'm adding a little bit of water again to the green stuff just to keep it from sticking real bad. You could use Vaseline as an alternative in that situation. I've done that before, and the Vaseline cleans up easy enough. Once the epoxy sets up a little bit, you can just clean it up with some alcohol. Here we go. I'm going to stick Ember on here. Now remember, earlier I said that I didn't push her feet back and they did separate out a little bit. Here you're going to see where I'm having trouble. Right there what I'm doing is I'm eyeballing it, so I'm making sure that I'm lined up with the tab coming off the bottom of her feet with the slot on the base. When you've got the top of it covered like that, you have to kind of look at it sideways so you can see the bottom of the base and make sure you get that tab lined up with where that slot is. You see right there how it pushed out some of the epoxy. We're going to come back with the X-Acto knife and just remove that excess epoxy. Sometimes in the process of doing that, I cut into the base just a little bit. That's not a big concern. If you end up shaving off a little bit of plastic. And there you go. She's in there. Had I pushed her feet back a little bit more, I probably wouldn't be having the trouble here that I am trying to push that down, trying to get that tab kind of pressed in there. Even though the tab's still visible, it's not the end of the world. Once it's painted and kind of blended into the base, most people looking at it won't really notice that. Here we go again. I'm just pressing over with the brick roller. We're getting ready to put Krusk down. Now the interesting thing about Krusk is one of his feet's actually raised. He's kind of in a pose where he's like running or charging. And I guess to help stabilize the miniature, they just have this excess material running up from where the tab was to the bottom of his foot. I was undecided at the time. I thought I was just going to leave that excess there and maybe cover it up with something, or just kind of paint it a neutral color and have it blend in. I end up cutting it off later. So I take a slightly different approach with Krusk than you saw me do with Ember. I'm going to be using that super glue. So I pushed him down in there to get the indentions from the tabs, and then I'm going to put a dab of super glue into those holes, and then I'll stick him back in there. Now because this is an epoxy putty, it actually adheres to the miniature fairly well. You don't have to use the super glue, but I do use it on some models just as kind of a precaution, just as an added feature to help it stick. Because the super glue will actually start to set up really quick when mixed with the epoxy putty. And you see Krusk falling down there. Sometimes that happens with top-heavy miniatures. Again, it's not a big deal because you have enough working time with the epoxy putty. You can usually correct anything like that happens. Currently what I'm doing is I'm digging out a bamboo skewer, which is another tool that I'm going to use here. And what I'm using it for is to help spread out any of the super glue that eased out around the foot and got into the crevices, or where the actual like mortar or dirt would be between the bricks or stones in that indentation that's in the epoxy there, where it's made it look kind of like a brick road. I'm just using the end of that bamboo skewer to smooth any of that out, so then later when I go to paint it, all those features are still noticeable. They're not all just filled in with glue. Here I'm just cleaning up the bottom again. You want to make sure that you do that, because if you don't, well, you're going to know, because the miniature's not going to sit flat. When you sit it down, the base and the entire miniature will be kind of cocked. And here I'm going to use some super glue accelerant. I wasn't really sure, and I'm still not really sure if it really makes a big difference with the epoxy, but what that's doing is helping the super glue set up a lot quicker. And rather than just spray it and have all these extra fumes, I just unscrew the lid and the tube that comes off of it that goes down to the bottom of the bottle for this sprayer. I just let the accelerant that's on there kind of drip off onto where I want it. Gives me a little more direct application. And there you see he still leans a little bit. But I'm going to straighten that up. And then overnight I did set him up against something that kind of held him up straight and made sure he's secured in a straight position. And then later the next day, once it was all set up, I actually came back and trimmed that and filed that off his foot. If you notice now, his foot's suspended. So here I'm just using some Vallejo primer. And because of some clear coating I had done just prior to this, and a little piece of the dry clear coat stuff got stuck in my airbrush, I start having some trouble here in a minute. It's not coming out real even. I have to set it down and then come back and hit it. Here's where I'm having trouble. And here we are with it all cleaned up, repriming him. So I'm actually holding him at an angle and spraying him kind of from what would be, from his perspective, from the bottom up, right? I'm spraying kind of from underneath the model to get all this shadowing and black primer in a position that's like beneath him, so when he's upright, we're going to be creating a zenithal effect with the primer is what we're going for. So right now I'm kind of doing what's called a natural application of the primer, where I'm spraying from the bottom up. And there you see me just kind of hitting the base. A lot of times with that initial coat of black primer, I do hit the whole miniature. Here I'm just touching up the crust, the Barbarian. Now I'm going to throw in some gray Vallejo primer. I'm not even going to bother pushing that black out. I'm just going to put in some gray, and then you'll see me backfeed the airbrush here in a minute just to get it all mixed up. And there we go. It's no longer spraying black, but gray. Now here I'm actually spraying at kind of a 45-degree angle on the model. So you know we have that black coming up from underneath, and here the gray is coming at like a 45. Again, we're going for what's called a zenithal prime effect. And here I held amber a little differently just to see if I could get a better angle captured for the camera. But I'm doing the same thing there. I'm just kind of spraying at her with that gray from a 45-degree angle. And there you can kind of see how her undersides are a little darker. There's some shadow. And now it's time for the white. The purpose of the zenithal prime is to give the miniature a look that the sun is coming down, or that whatever light source there is actually over the top of the miniature. So you're kind of doing pre-shading in a way is what you're actually doing. It'll help pick out details. So a lot of times I do that even if I think or know that I'm going to be using an opaque paint and maybe not doing real super thin layers that'll allow that to come through I'll still Zenithal Prime just because it gives me a good idea of where all the details are on the miniature as I paint it. Now here you see me just hitting the white from the top down with some other miniatures just to try to, again, just kind of extend that example of what it ends up looking like on the miniature. Here, I think this last one is actually the floor that goes to one of the other miniatures. That's a little unnecessary, but you get the idea. And here's what the Ember looks like when she's done and the primer's set up a little bit. See where the details really popping on the miniature now. Muscle tone, the wrinkles in her fabric. With Krusk. And there you have it. There's my prep and my prime. And here at the end we have the finished effects. Or I say the finished effects. This is what they look like when I got done painting them. This is Ember. And there's Krusk. And when it came to painting him, I did have a little bit more liberty. I was painting them along with the art that is in the player's handbook, but with him, because the sculpt's not quite the exact same as the art in the book, I had a little bit more liberty with it. Added some color to him. If you like the work you saw in this video, please like, share, and subscribe. I'm available for commissions at facebook.com, Barking Dogs Miniature Painting. You can also find us on Patreon at patreon.com/Barking Dog Studio. Patreon members get discounts on commissions and credit at the end of videos. Special thanks to the Clarks for their continued support. Bark on, puppies.